Shay stood in the doorway of Blake Leffler's corner office, with both hands wrapped around her phone as if it were the only solid thing left in her life. The city stretched behind him through the glass walls, millions of people moving below, unaware that a single sentence spoken in this room was about to change 3 lives forever. Blake didn't invite her to sit. "What's wrong?" he asked, though his eyes already said he didn't want the answer. She swallowed once, twice. "I went to the doctor this morning. I'm going to have a baby." The words landed softly, but they carried weight that bent the air between them. Blake turned away. His reflection stared back at him from the window. The billionaire CEO who bent markets to his will. The man who had clawed his way from nothing into everything. Yet this was something he had never planned for. "This can't be happening," he muttered. Shay stepped forward. "It is, and I wanted you to hear it from me." He spun around, eyes sharp. "You don't understand what you're doing." "I understand perfectly," she replied, her voice steady though her hand shook. "I'm keeping the baby." That was when fear took control of his mouth. "If you go through with this," he said, every word colder than the last, "I will destroy your family." The sentence hung there, heavy and final. Shay didn't cry. She didn't shout. She simply stared at him, the man she had loved, and whispered, "One day you'll understand what you just lost." Then she walked out. The door closed behind her with a soft click, but the sound echoed through Blake's chest louder than any slammed door ever could. Have you ever said something you wish you could erase? Not something small, not a careless joke or a moment of impatience, something that still shows up when the room is quiet, something that changed everything. Most of us carry at least one memory like that, a sentence that slipped out when fear was louder than love, a moment where pride took the wheel and kindness was left standing on the sidewalk. Maybe it was a text you never should have sent, a door you never reopened, a person you never chased after when you still had the chance. We tell ourselves we had no choice, that circumstances forced our hand, but deep down, we know the truth. It was a choice. Blake Leffler would spend the next 4 years replaying those 12 words in his head, wondering how a man who owned half of Manhattan could feel so completely powerless. From the outside, Blake had everything. Leffler Tech was a titan of the digital world. His name was spoken in boardrooms with admiration, in financial news with awe. People assumed men like him were built from something stronger than the rest of us. But Blake's hunger for control did not come from confidence. It came from a 13-year-old boy standing in a hallway while movers carried away his family's furniture. It came from a mother who stopped smiling after the reporters left. It came from the day he learned that money could vanish, that safety could shatter, that one bad season could erase a lifetime. That boy had made a promise in that empty house. No one would ever take everything from him again. So when Shay walked into his office with life growing inside her, Blake didn't see love. He saw risk. He saw headlines, lawsuits, stockholders, and vulnerability. He saw a crack in the wall he had spent his entire adulthood building, and he chose power over people. 4 years later, under a wide summer sky in Central Park, Blake would hear a child's voice float across a crowd. "Mommy, look at the bubbles." He would turn. And for the first time since the day Shay walked out of his office, Blake Leffler would feel his heart begin to change. But not yet, because the road between those two moments, the threat in the office and the laughter in the park, was paved with regret, lonely penthouses, and a little girl who had no idea how close her father came to losing her forever. Stay with me. If you believe that one mistake should not define an entire life, take a second and tap the like button right now. Subscribe to Mr. Cooper Stories so you never miss narratives that remind us how fragile and how powerful our choices truly are. And in the comments, tell me, have you ever wished you could take back a single sentence? Before everything fell apart, Blake Leffler's father used to wake before sunrise. The man wore pressed shirts even on weekends and polished his shoes while the coffee brewed. He kissed Blake's mother on the cheek each morning and reminded Blake that discipline was the closest thing to magic a person could own. His company was a regional financial firm that handled private investments. Nothing flashy, no marble lobbies or television interviews, just a solid reputation built over decades, brick by brick. Until one Monday in October, Blake came home from school that afternoon to find the living room television turned up louder than usual. His mother stood frozen in the doorway, her hand still on the remote. On the screen was his father, not the composed leader Blake knew, but a shaken man being escorted through a courthouse hallway by lawyers. The news anchor's voice filled the room. Following allegations of accounting misconduct, the board has removed Daniel Leffler from his position. Blake didn't understand what accounting misconduct meant. He only knew the look on his father's face. It was the same look Blake had seen once when their dog died, stunned, confused, as if the ground had tilted without warning. By nightfall, the phone began ringing. Friends, colleagues, people who once laughed loudly at their dinner table now spoke in clipped, careful tones. Some offered sympathy. Others asked questions no one in the house knew how to answer. By morning, the firm's offices were closed. By the end of the week, their savings were frozen. Blake's father stopped wearing pressed shirts. The first knock came just after breakfast. Blake was halfway through his cereal when he heard it. A sharp, impatient knock that did not belong to a neighbor. His mother peeked through the curtain, then let the fabric fall from her fingers as if it had burned her. "They're here," she whispered. Within minutes, the street outside filled with vans, camera crews, and men holding microphones with bright logos. Their quiet neighborhood, once known for bicycle rides and holiday lights, had turned into a daily spectacle. Blake watched from the upstairs window as his father left the house for the first time since the story broke. "Mr. Leffler, did you falsify company records? Do you deny the charges? What do you say to investors who lost their savings?" His father did not answer. He kept his eyes on the pavement, shoulders hunched as if he were walking through heavy rain, though the sky was clear. That afternoon, the school secretary called Blake out of class. "Your mother is here," she said, offering a smile that didn't quite hold together. On the ride home, Blake stared at his shoes while his mother drove with both hands clenched around the wheel. "They won't stop coming," she said. "Not for a while." Blake didn't reply. He'd already started learning the shape of shame. Before the scandal, Blake's mother was the heart of the house. She sang while she cooked. She kept a small herb garden by the kitchen window. Every Friday night, she made grilled cheese sandwiches and cut them into triangles because Blake liked them that way. After October, the singing stopped. She began sleeping on the couch. Her laughter, once loud enough to carry through the house, disappeared so completely Blake couldn't remember what it had sounded like. She answered calls with a flat voice and spent hours staring at bank statements spread across the dining table, like a puzzle missing half its pieces. One evening, Blake came home to find her sitting in the dark kitchen, holding a cup of tea that had gone untouched. "Mom?" he asked. She blinked, as though surprised to find him there. "I used to think if you worked hard enough, nothing could touch you," she said, her voice hollow. "I was wrong." Blake sat across from her, unsure what to say. He was 13, old enough to feel the weight in the room but too young to know how to lift it. That night, he lay in bed listening to the silence, realizing the house no longer felt like shelter. It felt like a waiting room. 3 months later, a pair of white trucks pulled into the driveway. Blake's mother had warned him the night before. They were downsizing, she said gently, using a word that felt too small for what was happening. Men in uniform moved through the rooms, lifting furniture, wrapping frames, carrying away the life Blake thought was permanent. His baseball trophies were boxed without ceremony. The couch where he and his father used to watch late-night movies disappeared through the front door. His mother's herb garden was left behind, brown and forgotten. Blake stood in the hallway while the movers worked around him. He touched the wall where his height had been marked every year on his birthday. The pencil lines were still there, but the future they pointed toward was gone. When the last truck pulled away, the house was empty. Not clean empty, vacant. Blake's mother sat at the kitchen table with her cold tea, staring at the dent where the table leg had pressed into the floor for years. The silence pressed against the walls. And for the first time, Blake felt afraid of quiet. That night, Blake walked through each room before going to bed. His room echoed when he spoke his own name. The living room no longer smelled like coffee. The hallway light flickered as if uncertain it should keep working. In his parents' bedroom, he found his father's old briefcase left behind, forgotten in the rush. He opened it and saw stacks of paper, neatly arranged, proof of a life that once made sense. Blake sat on the floor with that briefcase in his lap and felt something harden inside him. He did not cry. He made a promise. No one would ever take everything from him again. Not money, not safety, not control. That vow did not come with anger or tears. It came quietly, like a door locking in his chest. Blake Leffler would build an empire from that moment, but first, he would learn how expensive silence could be. Blake Leffler did not become powerful by accident. He entered college with a scholarship he barely qualified for and a work ethic that frightened people who watched him up close. While his roommates slept, Blake coded. While his classmates partied, Blake ran market simulations on a laptop that overheated so often he propped it on frozen packs from the cafeteria freezer. He wasn't chasing wealth for its shine. He was chasing insulation, distance from the fear he had lived with since the day movers emptied his house. At 21, he sold his first app to a data security firm for a number that felt unreal to him. He wired most of the money to his mother without telling her where it came from. She assumed it was a school grant. Blake didn't correct her. At 25, he left his master's program 2 credits short of completion and poured everything into a startup that no one else believed in. He called it Leffler Tech, not out of pride, but because he wanted the name back in the world under his control. The first 2 years were chaos. He slept in a shared workspace with a coat folded under his head. He showered at a gym across the street. His meals came from vending machines. But the product worked. Leffler Tech developed a platform that could process consumer behavior patterns in real time, faster and more accurately than anything on the market. Investors circled, contracts followed. By 30, Blake was no longer pitching ideas. He was choosing which ones deserved his attention. The boy who once stood in an empty hallway had learned how to build rooms around himself that no one could take away. Success changed the way people looked at Blake. Early employees remembered a version of him who smiled, who bought cheap pizza on Fridays and asked about their families. That man faded as the company grew. By the time Leffler Tech opened offices in 3 countries, Blake had become known as impossible to satisfy. He noticed everything. A missed decimal point, a slide that lacked clarity, a pitch that leaned on hope instead of data. Meetings with him felt like walking into a courtroom. "Do it again," he told a senior analyst once, sliding a proposal back across the table. "This looks like you settled." No one ever wanted to be the one who had settled. Managers stopped bringing in bad news. Assistants triple-checked schedules. Entire teams reworked projects late into the night just to avoid the quiet pause Blake used before pointing out a flaw. It wasn't cruelty. It was obsession. Blake believed excellence was the only protection he had left. The penthouse came when Leffler Tech went public, a glass-walled corner unit overlooking Manhattan. Floor-to-ceiling windows, furniture chosen by designers who never asked Blake what he liked, because he didn't know the answer. At night, he stood at the window with the drink he never finished, watching thousands of apartment lights blink on across the city. Each square of light held someone else's life. Dinner conversations, homework struggles, small celebrations. Blake rarely invited anyone into his. Most nights he ate standing at the kitchen counter, scrolling through performance metrics on his tablet while the skyline glowed behind him. The silence did not frighten him anymore. He had trained himself to live inside it. But it followed him. Sometimes he caught his reflection in the dark glass, the same face he had seen years earlier in his father's courthouse footage. Only now it was him avoiding his own eyes. There were moments when the armor cracked, like the night his mother called to tell him she had planted a new herb garden in her apartment window. "You used to help me with that," she said softly. Blake closed his eyes, remembering the smell of basil on summer mornings, the sound of her humming. He told her he was proud of her and promised to visit soon. He didn't. Work always came first. It was easier to manage numbers than people, easier to build software than rebuild a family. By the time Shea Russell walked into Leffler Tech with her notebook and quiet confidence, Blake Leffler was one of the most successful men in the city, and he had never felt more alone. Shea Russell arrived at Leffler Tech 10 minutes early, clutching a canvas tote that carried everything she owned for the day: a slim laptop, a reusable coffee cup, and a thick notebook whose edges were worn soft from years of use. She paused in the lobby before approaching the security desk, watching the rhythm of the building. People moved fast, speaking into headsets, fingers sliding across glass doors without slowing their stride. The walls were polished stone, the ceilings high enough to make whispers feel lost before they reached another person. This was not where Shay imagined herself when she was a kid. She grew up in a town small enough that everyone knew which mailbox belonged to which family. Her high school graduation class had barely cracked triple digits. Leffler Tech, by contrast, felt like a living system with no room for hesitation. "Can I help you?" the guard asked. She smiled. "First day." The word first felt heavier than she expected. Human Resources handed her a badge, a laminated map of the building, and a welcome packet with instructions that read like a technical manual. Shay tucked them into her bag and followed a coordinator through hallways that all looked the same: clean, modern, quiet. Her department was marketing, though nothing about the space resembled the playful agencies she had seen online. Desks were aligned in rows, screens glowed with analytics dashboards, and conversations were hushed, as if the walls themselves were listening. The coordinator introduced Shay to her team leader, a woman named Marissa, who spoke quickly and glanced at her watch as she talked. "You'll be assisting with brand narrative alignment," Marissa said. "Campaign drafts, message cohesion, that kind of thing. We move fast here, so don't take it personally if feedback is direct." Shay nodded, absorbing the words. As she took her seat, she pulled out her notebook and wrote a single sentence at the top of the first page. Every product has a story. It was something her college mentor once told her, that people do not buy features, they buy meaning. Shay had believed it ever since. Shay didn't look like most of the people at Leffler Tech. She wore soft sweaters instead of tailored blazers. Her desk held colored pens arranged in a small cup. She preferred writing drafts by hand before moving them to her laptop, a habit that drew puzzled looks from coworkers who measured everything in clicks and charts. At lunch, she ate in the break room rather than at her desk. She listened more than she spoke. When someone mentioned a campaign underperforming, Shay asked not about metrics, but about customers. "What are they afraid of?" she asked Marissa one afternoon. Marissa blinked. "Excuse me? The people who see our ads," Shay explained. "What problem are they trying to solve when they click?" Marissa hesitated. "They want efficiency." "That's not a feeling," Shay said gently. "What keeps them awake at night?" It was a question no one had ever asked in that room. By the end of her first week, Shay had rewritten a draft pitch that had already been approved by management. She didn't change the data. She changed the tone, shifting the focus from performance numbers to relief, clarity, and trust. When Marissa forwarded it to Blake Leffler for review, she did so with a note that read, "Not sure why, but this version works better." Blake read the draft twice. Then a third time. He didn't know who Shay Russell was yet, but he noticed something unusual in the copy. It did not sell. It spoke. The first time Blake saw Shay, it was close to midnight. He had stayed late reviewing quarterly projections when he noticed a light on in one of the small conference rooms. Most of the office had emptied hours earlier. Curiosity drew him down the hall. The door was open. Inside, Shay sat on the carpet, legs crossed, surrounded by printed slides, color swatches, and handwritten notes. Her shoes were off. Her hair was pulled into a loose knot that had surrendered to gravity. "You know there are chairs in here," Blake said. She jumped, then laughed at herself. "I think better on the floor." The words lingered in his mind longer than they should have. He looked at the boards lining the wall. They weren't charts or graphs. They were phrases, circles, arrows, a web of meaning rather than data. "What is all this?" he asked. She stood, brushing lint from her sweater. "The summer outreach campaign. I'm trying to figure out why people don't trust us." Blake folded his arms. "They trust us. Our numbers prove it." She tilted her head, studying him. "They use you. That's different." No one spoke to him that way. He waited for her to apologize. She didn't. Instead, she continued, "People don't wake up thinking about software. They wake up thinking about how not to fail their boss, their clients, their families. We should meet them there." Blake said nothing, but something inside him stirred, not irritation, but recognition. This was how he used to think, before growth turned feelings into liabilities. "Don't stay too late," he said eventually. She smiled. "I won't." But she did. A week later, Blake found himself walking past that same conference room again after another long evening. Shay was there, again. He didn't announce himself this time. He simply sat down on the carpet across from her. She looked up, startled. "Is this a surprise meeting?" "No," he said. "I just wanted to see how thinking on the floor works." She laughed, and the sound felt out of place in a building that had forgotten how to relax. They talked for nearly an hour. Not about work, about her hometown, about the way her father used to repair broken radios just to see how they were made, about how she believed stories were the first technology humans ever created. Blake found himself telling her things he hadn't said out loud in years, about his mother's garden, about the house that no longer existed, about how he measured success in safety rather than happiness. When he stood to leave, the office felt different, not warmer, more human, and for the first time in a decade, Blake Leffler walked back to his penthouse with something he couldn't quantify, the faint sense that a locked door inside him had begun to open. After the night on the conference room floor, Blake began noticing how often Shay stayed late. It wasn't deliberate at first. He simply found himself finishing meetings more quickly, walking the halls instead of calling his driver, lingering on floors he had no reason to visit. And more often than not, the glass door to the balcony outside the marketing wing was cracked open, letting in the city breeze. That balcony had always been empty, too exposed, too informal. But Shay liked it. One evening he stepped outside and found her leaning against the rail, notebook balanced on her knee, watching the traffic far below like it was part of a story she hadn't finished yet. "You're going to freeze," he said. She closed the notebook. "It reminds me I'm still here." They stood side by side, not close enough to touch, but close enough to share the same quiet. Blake studied her. "You don't seem loud. That's why I like the balcony." It became their place. 5 minutes before he left for the night, Blake would wander down that hall. Sometimes Shay was there, sometimes she wasn't, but when she was, time bent in small ways he couldn't explain. They talked about nothing. The best coffee in the city, the worst subway delays, how neither of them remembered the last movie they'd watched in a theater. Then, one night, Blake said something he hadn't meant to. "I don't remember the last time someone asked me how I was doing." Shay didn't answer right away. She just turned toward him and waited. It was an invitation. Shay had never planned to talk about her past at work, but the city lights had a way of making memories feel closer, like windows left open too long. "My parents didn't have much," she said, resting her arms on the rail, "but they made the little things feel big." She told him about her father's habit of leaving handwritten notes in her lunchbox, about her mother staying up late to help neighbors with paperwork because she believed everyone deserved to be understood. They weren't perfect, Shay admitted, but they were present, even when it was hard. She paused, then added, "My mom used to say that love is loudest when it shows up quietly." Blake looked at her hands, steady on the cold metal. "My parents tried," he said. It was the closest he had come to praise in years. She nodded, sensing there was more. He didn't know why he started talking. He only knew he didn't want to stop. He told her about the day the trucks came, about the reporters, about his mother's herb garden left behind. "I promised myself I would never let that happen again," he said. "I thought if I worked hard enough I could lock the world out." Shay listened without interrupting. "I built everything you see," Blake continued, gesturing toward the skyline, "because I was afraid of losing it." "You didn't build it," Shay said softly. "You hid inside it." The words didn't sting. They landed with truth. He had never said these things out loud, not to colleagues, not to friends he didn't have, not even to his mother. The balcony became less about air and more about release. From then on, they spoke often. Not every night. Not with intention, but with gravity. They learned each other's habits. Blake's tendency to arrive with questions he didn't ask in meetings. Shay's way of folding the corner of her notebook pages when something mattered. Once, when Shay caught a cold, Blake sent tea to her desk without a note. She sent back a thank you written on the back of a sticky label. Another evening, the wind cut sharper than usual. Blake offered his jacket without comment. Shay accepted it without ceremony. They never named what was forming between them. They didn't need to. It was there, in the pauses, in the way Blake waited to leave until Shay closed her notebook, in the way Shay always lingered an extra moment after saying goodnight. Two broken people, leaning quietly against the same rail, beginning to feel less alone. The first time they were trapped together, it happened without drama. Blake had just ended a late board call when he noticed Shay standing near the elevators, tapping her badge against the reader even though the doors were already closing. "Long day?" he asked. She exhaled. Every day lately, they stepped inside at the same time. The doors slid shut. The car dropped half a floor, then stopped. At first, neither of them spoke. Elevators paused all the time in this building. Then the lights dimmed, and the emergency system clicked on with a calm, pre-recorded voice explaining that assistance was on the way. Blake pressed the help button out of reflex. No response. Shay slid down the wall until she was sitting on the floor. Of all the places to get stuck, she said, glancing at him, it had to be here. Blake laughed. The sound surprised both of them. They waited in the quiet hum of backup power, trading small talk that drifted into something softer. Shay told him about the radio her father had rebuilt from broken parts. Blake admitted he had never learned how to cook anything that didn't come in a box. When the doors finally opened, nearly 40 minutes later, neither of them rushed out. They stood in the hallway, neither quite ready to end a moment that had no business feeling that comfortable. A week later, the city was soaked. Rain hammered the streets so hard it blurred the traffic lights into streaks of red and gold. Blake found Shay on the balcony, jacket wrapped around herself, notebook forgotten on the bench beside her. "You'll catch something," he said. She looked at the sky. "It's the first rain like this since I moved here. I didn't want to miss it." They stood shoulder to shoulder while the storm passed below them. "I don't think you like being strong," Shay said suddenly. Blake turned to her. "What makes you say that?" "Because you look tired of carrying everything alone." He thought about deflecting, about returning to safer ground. Instead, he said, "Being strong is all I know." Shay's voice softened. "Then maybe I'll teach you something lighter." The rain fell harder, and for a moment the whole city seemed to fade away. After that night, they developed a language that belonged only to them. If a meeting dragged on too long, Shay would doodle a tiny coffee cup in the margin of her notebook and slide the page across the table. Blake would glance at it and excuse himself with an invented call. When Blake walked into the marketing wing too late in the evening, Shay would look at her watch and say, "You missed dinner." He never corrected her. They found humor in things no one else noticed, the way the security desk chair squeaked, the way one elevator always stopped a fraction of a second too late. Laughter returned to Blake's days, quietly, without warning. They never spoke the word love. There were no declarations, no dramatic gestures. Blake began to leave the office earlier, just in case Shay was still there. Shay started staying later, just in case Blake came looking. They learned each other's rhythms. They learned each other's pauses. It was not a romance built on fireworks. It was built on listening. If this story is making you smile right now, take a moment and tap the like button. Your support keeps these stories coming, and your comments let me know you're still here with me. Shay didn't come to Blake's office that morning because she wanted to. She came because the test in her bathroom trash can would not leave her alone. 2 lines. Not bold, not faint, certain. She spent the subway ride rehearsing sentences she never got to finish in her head. By the time she reached Leffler Tech, the building felt larger than usual, as if every hallway were asking her to turn back. Blake was reviewing contracts when she knocked. "Come in," he said without looking up. She stood there longer than he expected. When he finally raised his eyes, he saw that her usual calm was gone. "What's wrong?" he asked. She closed the door behind her. "Do you remember when you said I taught you something lighter?" He nodded slowly. "I need to tell you something," Shay continued. "And I don't know how to make it sound easy." Her hands were trembling. Blake stood, suddenly alert, in a way board meetings never required. "I went to the doctor this morning," she said. "I'm going to have a baby." For a few seconds, Blake heard nothing but the hum of the air system. He walked to the window, turned his back to her, and stared at the city that had always felt like his shield. This was not part of his design. He told himself to breathe. Instead, his mind filled with noise, shareholders, media, lawsuits, his name tied to something he could not manage. His mother's face when the world took everything from her, the house without furniture, the pencil marks on the wall that meant nothing now. This was how it started last time. Loss always arrived quietly first. He turned back to Shay. She was still standing where he had left her, eyes steady despite the storm behind them. "You're sure?" he asked. She nodded. Blake felt the floor tilt, not under his feet, but under his plans. Every layer of protection he had built felt suddenly thin. "This can't be happening," he said. "It is," Shay replied, "and I'm not afraid." That was when he realized he was. He paced the room, words colliding in his mouth before forming any shape. "You don't understand what this means," he said. "This company is not built for surprises." Shay stepped closer. "This isn't a surprise, it's a life." The word struck him wrong. Life was not something he controlled. "If you think this won't affect everything, you're wrong," Blake said. "People will talk. They always do." She met his eyes. "I don't care what people say." He did. And the fear he had never learned to name finally spoke for him. "If you go through with this," he said, voice low and sharp, "I will destroy your family." The moment the sentence left his mouth, the room changed. Shay did not react the way he expected. She didn't argue. She didn't plead. She simply stared at him. "One day," she said, so softly he almost missed it, "you'll understand what you just lost." She turned and walked out. Blake followed her into the hall, calling her name, but the sound of his own voice felt foreign, like it belonged to someone else. She reached the elevator just as the doors began to close. "Wait," he said. She did not look back. The doors slid together, cutting him off from the woman who had taught him how to breathe again. Blake stood there long after the light above the elevator went dark, staring at his reflection in the metal. For the first time since he was 13, power did not feel like protection. It felt like loss. Shay left the city on a Tuesday morning with a single suitcase and the weight of a future she hadn't planned but refused to abandon. The train ride felt longer than usual, every mile stretching the distance between the life she had just lost and the one she was trying to build. The skyline faded into low buildings, then open fields, then towns where the station still had hand-painted signs and benches that carried the memory of 100 waiting feet. Her hometown had not changed. The bakery still released warm bread smells into the street at dawn. The hardware store window still displayed tools no one under 40 seemed to buy anymore. Even the mural on the side of the library, painted by students who had long since moved away, remained untouched by time. Shay stood on the platform with her suitcase and waited. Her mother's car arrived 10 minutes later, tires crunching over gravel in a sound Shay had not realized she missed. Neither of them spoke at first. They didn't need to. Her mother pulled her into a hug that was firm, not fragile. "I made soup," she said into Shay's shoulder. "The kind you like." Her father waited until they were inside the car before reaching back to squeeze Shay's hand. "No questions," he said. "You tell us when you're ready." That night, they sat at the same kitchen table Shay had done homework at as a child. The chairs were mismatched, the table's surface marked with years of use. It was imperfect in all the ways the penthouse had never been. "I'm going to have a baby," Shay said finally. Her parents looked at each other, then back at her. Her mother's eyes filled. Her father's shoulders relaxed. "Well," her mother said, smiling through tears, "that explains the soup cravings. Just space to breathe." Labor began in the early hours of a quiet spring morning. Her mother drove while her father kept time on his watch, whispering encouragement with each mile. The hospital was small, nothing like the polished facility Shay had seen in the city, but every nurse knew her parents by name. The room was calm, the lights were gentle. When the baby arrived, Shay felt a kind of stillness she had never known. Tiny fingers wrapped around her own, and in that moment, everything she had lost made sense. They named her Sally. It was her grandmother's name. A woman who had once crossed state lines alone with a suitcase and a hope she never put into words. As Shay held her daughter for the first time, she whispered, "You're safe here," and she meant it. Shay's savings lasted longer than she expected, and not nearly long enough. At first, the work came in polite drips. A bakery owner who needed a new online menu, a fitness studio that wanted help telling its story without sounding like every other place in town. Shay charged less than she should have, telling herself that experience mattered more than money. She worked during Sally's, naps, during the quiet hours before dawn, during the slow evenings when the house felt too still. She learned how to type with one hand while rocking a crib with the other, how to stretch grocery lists without making them feel like sacrifice. Some nights she stared at her laptop long after the screen blurred, wondering how many drafts she could send before a client stopped replying. But she kept going. Her parents' dining table became her office. There were no boardrooms, no glass walls, no assistants scheduling her life, just a stack of notebooks, a mug that never stayed warm, and a small lamp whose cord had been taped together more times than she could count. Sally learned the shape of that table before she learned to walk. She learned the rhythm of keystrokes the way other children learned lullabies. When clients apologized for late payments, Shay smiled into the phone and said she understood. Then she set the baby monitor a little closer and typed a little faster. Sally's first word was "Mama." It happened on a Tuesday afternoon while Shay was halfway through rewriting a product description for a local gardening shop. She thought she had imagined, until Sally repeated it, louder this time, reaching both arms toward her. Shay closed the laptop without saving. They spent the rest of the afternoon on the living room floor, surrounded by blocks that refused to stay stacked and laughter that filled every corner. Years passed in moments like that. First steps between chair and sofa, first scraped knee soothed with a kiss. First day of preschool, Sally clutching Shay's sleeve as if the world might steal her away. Shay never let it. There were no speeches about courage in that house, no framed quotes, just showing up. When bills were late, Shay found more work. When Sally asked why they didn't live in a tall building like her friend's family, Shay said, "Because our house fits us better." And it did. It held homework at the kitchen table, hand-me-down furniture, and a future that was not built on power but on presence. By the time Sally turned 4, Blake Leffler had crossed another invisible line in the business world. Leffler Tech was no longer a rising company. It was a fixture, the kind of brand mentioned in policy briefings and long-term planning documents, the kind that reshaped entire sectors without asking permission. Blake's name appeared in magazines beneath headlines that celebrated vision, discipline, and relentless drive. He read none of them. His days were carved into 15-minute blocks. Breakfast meetings bled into investor calls, which dissolved into strategic reviews that never quite ended. Every hour brought a decision that affected people he would never meet. At night, he stood before the same glass walls he had admired for years, watching the city breathe in steady pulses of light. The view had not changed. He had. The numbers no longer meant anything beyond confirmation that the machine was still moving. He approved expansions, rejected partnerships, and signed documents that carried consequences he did not feel until long after the ink dried. Once, during a quarterly presentation, an analyst congratulated him on the company's unbreakable foundation. Blake nodded, thanked the team, and moved on. He did not mention that foundations are not meant to be lived on. There was a park 2 blocks from his building. It had a playground, benches shaded by tall trees, and a small splash area that came alive every summer afternoon. Blake passed it daily on the way to charity events and corporate luncheons, always on the opposite side of the street. He told himself it was because of the crowds. The truth was simpler. The sound of children made his chest tighten. Their voices carried something he had not allowed himself to imagine in years. He would lower the window in the back of his car just enough to hear it, then raise it again before the feeling could take shape. One evening, his driver asked if he wanted to take the longer route home to avoid traffic. Sure, Blake said. It was the route that passed, the park. He stared straight ahead as the car rolled past swings in motion and parents seated on benches watching over lives that were still small enough to hold. He did not turn his head. The line returned to him in fragments, in the shower, in the silence before sleep, in the narrow space between meetings when no one was watching. If you go through with this, I will destroy your family. He had never said anything like that to anyone before or since. He tried to justify it as fear, as pressure, as stress that had nowhere else to go. But none of those words softened the echo. One night he dreamed of the empty house from his childhood, only this time it was his. He woke before dawn and sat on the edge of his bed, the city still dark beyond the windows. Blake Leffler had everything he had once sworn to protect, and nothing he had ever meant to keep. Blake did not attend charity expos because he enjoyed them. They were part of the job now, an obligation that came with influence. He funded schools, donated to healthcare initiatives, and appeared at events with smiling hosts who spoke about generosity while measuring the number of cameras in the room. This one was held in Central Park on a warm Saturday in June. Tents lined the walking paths. Volunteers in matching shirts guided families toward craft tables and food trucks. Somewhere in the distance, a string quartet struggled to compete with laughter and music. Blake walked through the crowd with his communications director, nodding at names he barely registered. "You've done a lot of good this year," she said, gesturing toward a banner bearing Leffler Tech's logo. He thanked her politely. He did not feel it. That was when he heard it. "Mommy, look at the bubbles." The voice was high and clear, cutting through the background noise like a bell. Blake turned without thinking. A little girl was chasing a trail of soap bubbles drifting above the grass. In her other hand, she held a pink balloon shaped like a star. It bobbed over her head as if trying to keep up with her excitement. She tripped, then caught herself, giggling as her shoes skidded across the dirt. Blake froze. The child looked familiar in a way he could not place. Not her face, but the energy of her, the fearlessness. He watched her run back toward a woman standing near a park bench, her back turned. "If you believe people can change, let me know your thoughts in the comments." Sally did not know that 3 lives were shifting around her. To her, the park was a place of snacks and sunlight, of bubbles that never lasted long enough and balloons that somehow always escaped just out of reach. She tugged at Shay's hand, then looked back at Blake as if he were already part of the day. "Are you going to help me catch the bubbles or just stand there?" she asked. Blake hesitated. He had negotiated billion-dollar deals with steadier nerves than he felt in that moment. He held out his hand. Sally took it. They walked toward the open patch of grass where volunteers were handing out bubble wands. Shay followed a few steps behind, close enough to hear, far enough to give them space. Sally dipped the wand into the solution and waved it with dramatic flair. The bubbles floated upward, catching light, drifting over the heads of people who didn't know what they were passing through. "My mom says bubbles are like promises," Sally said. "They look big, but they only last if you take care of them." Blake swallowed. "Your mom sounds smart." "She is," Sally replied, without hesitation. They sat together on the bench while the afternoon shifted around them. Sally talked about preschool, about a friend who always stole the purple crayon, about the way her teacher made pancakes shaped like animals. Blake listened to every word as if it were proof that the world still held room for him. At some point, the noise of the park faded. Blake stared at Sally's small shoes swinging above the ground and felt something tear open inside him. He remembered another pair of shoes, years ago, hanging from a chair while he waited for his mother to come home from the bank. He remembered the smell of cardboard boxes, the echo of rooms without furniture. He had sworn never to let a child feel that loss, and yet, Shay joined him. "I don't deserve this," Blake said. His voice did not carry. It barely existed. "I threatened you. I tried to take everything." Shay waited. "I don't know how to be anything but afraid," he continued. "I built my life around never needing anyone, and now I'm standing here wondering how I missed 4 years of her life." Tears came before he realized what was happening. Shay did not rush to comfort him. She did not remind him of the pain he caused her, the years he lost. She simply stood there, allowing him to see what he had been afraid to face. "I didn't come here today expecting to see you," she said at last. "But I also didn't come here carrying anger." He looked at her. "I learned how to be okay without you," she continued. "Not because I stopped caring, because I had to." Sally's laughter drifted over to them as she chased another bubble. "She deserves people who show up," Shay said. "Not just money, not just words. It was something you were allowed to earn." Blake did not go back to his penthouse after Central Park. He walked, past the restaurants he never entered, past the park he had avoided for years, past streets that once existed only as blurred scenery behind tinted windows. His phone vibrated with messages he did not read. There was only one place he needed to be. His mother's apartment was on the 4th floor of a brick building that smelled faintly of cleaning soap and old books. She answered the door with surprise still written on her face. "Blake, I need to talk," he said. "Please." They sat at a small kitchen table that looked nothing like the one from his childhood. The old house had been replaced by a modest apartment and a quiet life she had learned to build without him. "I saw her today," Blake said. "And my daughter—" His mother's hand stilled. "You have a child?" "I do, and I almost lost her before she was even born." He told her everything, about Shay, about the words he could not take back, about the park bench and the pink balloon. His mother listened without interruption. When he finished, she reached for his hand. "You didn't protect yourself that day," she said gently. "You protected your fear." The truth settled in his chest with no place to hide. Blake began with the smallest repairs. He asked his mother about the herb garden she once kept. She laughed and told him she had given up after the move, then tried again years later with a single basil plant that refused to grow. They planted a new one together that weekend. He did not call a gardener. He did not ask for help. He got dirt under his nails and let himself be awkward. Then he called Shay, not to apologize, not to explain, to ask. "What do you need?" he said. The question surprised both of them. The answer was not immediate. Trust does not return on schedule. Blake met Shay and Sally at playgrounds he once avoided. He learned which snacks Sally preferred and how she hated shoes with stiff backs. He showed up to school recitals and sat quietly at the edge of rooms where he had no authority. Sometimes Shay watched him with caution. Sometimes she smiled, and sometimes that was enough. The first time Blake walked into the playground beside Shay and Sally, he felt like a visitor in a country that had never printed his passport. The air was filled with shouts, the scuff of sneakers, the rustle of leaves shaken loose by running feet. Children gathered around slides that were too small for grown men to consider without embarrassment, yet Blake found himself standing there with his hands in his pockets, unsure where to put the weight of his attention. Sally solved the problem for him. "Push me," she said, already climbing onto a swing. He placed his palms against her back and gave a cautious nudge. The swing crept forward with little ambition. She turned her head. "Harder. You won't break me." Blake smiled despite himself and pushed again. This time the arc widened, Sally's laugh cutting through the late afternoon like a ribbon being pulled free. He pushed her higher and higher until her shoes skimmed the open sky. "You're flying!" she shouted. Blake felt his chest open in a way no contract ever had. Shay watched from the bench, arms folded not in defense but in habit, studying the way Blake leaned forward each time he sent Sally soaring. It was the posture of someone trying not to fail. He didn't know it yet, but this would become their ritual. Not the boardroom, not the penthouse, the playground. They started with Sunday dinners. Shay cooked because she enjoyed it. Blake washed dishes because he was terrible at chopping vegetables. Sally insisted on setting the table, which meant every fork was placed in the wrong spot, and every napkin was folded into shapes no one recognized. Conversation at first was careful, not awkward, just new. Blake talked about work only when Sally asked why people needed computers if they could already talk to each other. Shay told stories about her freelance clients, careful not to make them sound like struggles. One night, Sally tried to use a grown-up word she had heard at school and placed it in a sentence that made absolutely no sense. Blake laughed before he could stop himself. It wasn't a quiet laugh. It filled the room. Shay stared at him for a moment, then began laughing too, until Sally joined in without knowing why. The sound surprised all three of them. Months passed, not the dramatic kind, the ordinary kind that stack into something meaningful only when you look back. Blake did not become a perfect father overnight. He forgot important dates. He bought the wrong size shoes. He still flinched when control slipped from his grip. But he showed up, and each time he did, the old promise he made as a boy began to change shape. It was no longer about never losing anything. It was about not running when something mattered. One afternoon, Blake stood with Shay at the edge of the playground, watching Sally organize her friends into an elaborate game with rules only she understood. "She's fearless," Blake said. She's loved, Shay replied. He nodded, understanding at last that the world does not become safe when you hold it tighter. It becomes safe when you hold it together. If this story reminded you that love is stronger than fear, tap subscribe on Mr. Cooper's Stories right now, because the next story might be the one that changes your life.